On March 28, 1757, 4 horses pulled in 4 different directions for over 2 hours, and a man's body refused to come apart. The executioners had done everything by the book. The ropes were secure, the horses were in position, the crowds were watching, and yet, attempt after attempt, some accounts say as many as 60, the limbs would not separate from the torso. This wasn't supposed to happen. The sentence had been designed to mirror an execution from 147 years earlier, when the assassin Ravaillac was torn apart for killing King Henry IV. That execution had worked. This one was becoming a spectacle of failure. The man being pulled apart was Robert-François Damiens, a 42-year-old domestic servant who had stabbed King Louis XV with a penknife. The wound, 1 centimetre deep. The king recovered in 8 days. For that single centimetre of penetration, Damiens would endure 4 hours of systematic torture that included molten lead poured into open wounds, his flesh torn away with red-hot pincers, and finally, the horses. What happened on that scaffold in the Place de Greve would become so notorious that 218 years later, the philosopher Michel Foucault would open his most famous book with a detailed account of it. The execution was meant to demonstrate absolute royal power. Instead, it would reveal something the French monarchy never intended anyone to see. To understand what drove a servant to stab a king, and why that king's government responded with such calculated brutality, we need to understand that France in early 1757 was a nation eating itself alive. The 7 Years' War had begun the previous year, and it was going catastrophically. In November and December of 1756, French forces had been humiliated at the Battle of Rossbach and the Battle of Leuthen. Prussian forces under Frederick the Great were making France look incompetent on the battlefield, and the British naval blockade was strangling French commerce so effectively that ordinary people could feel it in their empty pockets. King Louis XV, once called Louis the Beloved, had become Louis the Despised. His extravagant lifestyle continued while his subjects suffered. His chief mistress, Madame de Pompadour, a common-born woman who had been elevated to power through the king's bedchamber, was blamed by nearly everyone for the military disasters. Rightly or wrongly, people believed she was influencing decisions that sent French soldiers to their deaths. And beneath all of this, beneath the military humiliation, beneath the economic suffering, beneath the hatred of the king's mistress, there was something even more dangerous brewing. A religious war, not the kind fought with armies, the kind fought with something far more personal, the refusal to let dying people receive their last rites. Since the 1640s, France had been divided by a theological dispute called the Jansenist controversy. On one side were the Jansenists, austere reformers who believed in strict moral discipline and predestination. On the other side were the Jesuits, who advocated for a more lenient approach to salvation. For over a century, this dispute had simmered. By the 1750s, it had become a crisis that touched every parish in France. The Archbishop of Paris, Christophe de Beaumont, had begun refusing the sacraments, including last rites, to anyone who wouldn't sign documents condemning Jansenism. Think about what that means. If you were dying and you wouldn't sign a theological declaration, a priest could refuse to give you communion. You could die without the Church's blessing. For devout Catholics in the 18th century, this was spiritual terrorism. Clergy who defied the Archbishop and administered sacraments to non-signers faced losing their positions or receiving lettres de cachet, arbitrary arrest warrants that could throw them into prison without trial. Now imagine you're a servant. You move from household to household. You work for minor nobles and clergy. You hear conversations at dinner tables. You serve wine while magistrates complain about the Archbishop. You clear plates while priests argue about the king's responsibility for this crisis. You don't have power. You don't have influence. You don't have education. What you have is rage. Robert-François Damiens was born on January 9th, 1715, in La Théolouaille, a small town near Arras. By 1757, he was 42 years old, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, and his life had been a slow cascade of failures. He had worked as a domestic servant in various households, but he kept getting dismissed. The reasons: misconduct, petty theft, an inability to stay employed. His nickname among those who knew him was Robert le Diable, Robert the Devil. By the time he decided to kill the king, his occupation had degraded to selling balls to take spots out of clothes, cleaning products hawked door to door. This was not a master conspirator. This was not a calculating assassin. This was a man whose life had collapsed into poverty and whose mind had become fixated on a single idea. The king was responsible for the spiritual suffering of France, and someone needed to stop him. The question that would haunt investigators for months was simple. Was Damiens acting alone? Because if a destitute cleaning products salesman could simply walk up to the King of France and stab him, that was terrifying enough. If someone had sent him, if the Jansenists or the Jesuits or the magistrates of the Parlement had orchestrated this, that was an entirely different kind of threat. The answer Damiens gave would never satisfy anyone. The evening of January 5th, 1757, was cold. King Louis XV was at the Palace of Versailles, preparing to enter his carriage. He was bundled against the winter chill in heavy clothes, including a thick velvet surtout, an overcoat designed to protect against the cold. That overcoat would save his life. Damiens had somehow made his way past the royal bodyguards. In his hand was a small penknife, the kind of blade a common person might use for everyday tasks. It had two blades of different sizes, neither designed for assassination. As the king moved toward his carriage, Damiens rushed forward and struck. The blade hit Louis XV between the fourth and fifth ribs. It penetrated exactly 1 centimetre into his chest, less than half an inch. The heavy winter clothing had absorbed most of the force. The king at first didn't even realise he'd been stabbed. He thought someone had punched him or elbowed him in the crowd. It was only when he felt the wetness of blood on his hand that the reality hit him. And then Louis XV, the most powerful man in France, nearly fainted. Convinced he was dying, the king called for a confessor. He tearfully begged his wife, Queen Marie Leszczyńska, for forgiveness for his numerous affairs. He prepared his soul for death. He would recover completely within 8 days. Damiens made no attempt to escape. When guards seized him and demanded to know who he was, he answered calmly, "'Tis I," as if they should have been expecting him. Damiens was taken immediately to the conciergerie prison, and the interrogation began almost before the blood on the king's shirt had dried. The magistrates were desperate. They needed to find the conspiracy. There had to be a conspiracy. A lone madman with a penknife was one thing. A coordinated plot against the throne was something the government could fight, could expose, could crush publicly. The torture started quickly. Damiens' legs were placed in boots, specialised devices that could crush the limbs slowly, applying increasing pressure until bones began to crack. His calves were pinched with red-hot tongs. He screamed. He begged. He did not name accomplices. Under torture, Damiens said strange things. He claimed to have been inspired by everybody around him. He said he had spoken to priests in Arras and Paris who belonged to the Parlement. He insisted that the refusal of sacraments was the root cause of everything, that the king's failure to stop the archbishop had driven him to act. He spoke cryptically about the future. He warned that the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, should be careful, because 6 months after his death more important events will occur, and the Dauphin will perish along with many other people. What did that mean? No one knew. Damiens himself may not have known. When pressed again and again to name his accomplices, he had only one answer. I have no accomplices. The trial of Robert-François Damiens lasted from February 12th to March 26th, 1757. 6 weeks of testimony, interrogation, and legal manoeuvring. The Parlement of Paris was determined to find evidence of conspiracy. Investigators followed every lead Damiens had given them. They questioned the priests he had mentioned. They examined his movements in the weeks before the attack. They scrutinised his connections to Jansenist circles. They found nothing. Or rather, they found a man who had been surrounded by political and religious chaos, who had absorbed the anger and frustration of those around him, and who had convinced himself that killing the king would be a good work that would earn him a heavenly reward. The magistrates faced an uncomfortable possibility. Damiens might actually be telling the truth. He might be nothing more than a mentally unstable fanatic who had acted alone. This was, in some ways, more terrifying than a conspiracy. A conspiracy could be dismantled. A lone madman emerging from a crowd with a penknife, how do you prevent that? On March 26th, the Parlement of Paris delivered its sentence. Robert-François Damiens was guilty of parricide against the person of the king, the ultimate crime in the old regime. The punishment would be the ultimate punishment. They deliberately modelled the sentence on the execution of François Ravaillac, the man who had assassinated King Henry IV in 1610. The message was clear. 147 years had passed, but the royal will remained unchanged. Strike at the king, and you would die in exactly the same way. On the morning of March 28, 1757, Robert-François Damiens was brought from his cell. According to legend, when he was told what was about to happen to him, he responded with dark resignation. La journée sera rude. The day will be hard. The first ritual was the amende honorable, the public penance. Damiens was stripped naked and placed in a tip cart. In his hands, the executioners forced him to hold a 2-pound burning wax torch. The cart carried him through the streets of Paris to the main gate of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. There, before an assembled crowd, he was forced to kneel. The words he was required to speak had been written for him by the court. He had to declare publicly that he had committed a very mean, very terrible and very dreadful parricide against the king. He had to beg forgiveness from God, from the king, and from justice itself. Whether Damiens believed these words or simply recited them because he had no choice, we don't know. What we know is that after the ceremony at Notre Dame, he was loaded back into the cart and taken to the Place de Greve. The main event was about to begin. The Place de Greve was the great public square where executions took place in Paris. A scaffold had been erected at its centre. Around the scaffold, an immense crowd had gathered. Some accounts suggest more than 1,600 spectators. Among those watching was Giacomo Casanova, the famous adventurer and libertine. He had rented a first-floor window overlooking the scaffold for 3 louis d'or, a small fortune for a viewing spot. Casanova wanted to see everything. He would later write that he watched the dreadful sight for 4 hours and was several times obliged to turn away my face and to stop my ears. 4 hours. The execution was supposed to proceed in stages. First, the torture of the hand that had held the knife. Then, the tearing of flesh with red-hot pincers. Then, the pouring of molten substances into the wounds. Finally, the dismemberment by horses. Each stage was designed to maximize suffering. Each stage was designed to be witnessed by the crowd. The entire spectacle was meant to demonstrate that the king's justice was absolute, that his power over the bodies of his subjects was total. What actually happened would undermine every single one of those messages. The first punishment focused on Damiens' right hand, the hand that had gripped the penknife. The executioners forced him to take hold of the knife itself. Then they held his hand over a flame of burning sulphur. Here was the first failure. The flame was too weak. It barely burned the top layer of skin. The executioners tried again, and again. Each attempt caused Damiens unbearable pain, but the dramatic effect the judges had envisioned, the hand that struck at majesty being consumed by fire, simply wasn't materializing. The initial executioner, the uncle of the young chief executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, was so overwhelmed by what he was being asked to do that he offered money to someone else to take over. A man named André Legris stepped forward. He accepted the payment. He picked up the red-hot pincers. The real torture was about to begin. The pincers were about 18 inches long, designed to grip and tear human flesh. They had been heated until they glowed. Legris seized Damiens' body and began to tear. The flesh came away in chunks, from his calves, his thighs, his chest, his arms. Each wound was about the size of a 6-pound crown piece. Damiens screamed with every tear. According to observers, he screamed without swearing. Even in his agony, he did not curse. Between each tear, Legris would dip an iron spoon into a pot of boiling liquid. The mixture contained boiling oil, resin, molten sulphur, and molten lead. He would pour this mixture directly into the open wounds. Witnesses reported that between screams, Damiens would raise his head and look down at his own body. He seemed unable to comprehend what was being done to him. He seemed to be watching his own destruction as if it were happening to someone else. His cries echoed across the Place de Greve. "My God, give me strength. Give me strength. Lord, my God, have pity on me. Lord, my God, I am suffering so much. Lord, my God, give me patience." When the magistrates overseeing the execution asked him one final time if he would reveal his accomplices, Damiens' answer was the same as it had always been. "I have no accomplices or statements to make." After the pincers, ropes were attached to Damiens' 4 limbs. 4 horses were brought forward, 1 for each arm and 1 for each leg. Each horse faced a different direction, north, south, east, west. At the signal from the judges, the handlers began to drive the horses forward. The idea was simple. The horses would pull, the limbs would separate. Damiens would be torn into 5 pieces, 4 limbs and a torso. The remains would be burned. Justice would be served. The horses pulled. Nothing happened. The horses pulled again, and again. Damiens' body stretched. His joints strained. His screams intensified. His limbs did not separate. The handlers drove the horses harder. Some accounts suggest the handlers were drunk, which may have affected their effectiveness. Others suggest the horses themselves were simply not strong enough for the task. Whatever the reason, the execution had become a grotesque failure. For over 2 hours, the horses pulled. Some accounts say there were as many as 60 separate attempts. Each time, the handlers would drive the horses forward. Each time, Damiens' body would stretch to the point of agony. Each time, the limbs would hold. The crowd, which had come to witness the terrible majesty of royal justice, was instead witnessing something that looked increasingly like incompetence. The spectacle that was meant to terrify was becoming absurd. Casanova, watching from his rented window, later described the scene with horror and disgust. The crowd around him, the Lambertini and the fat aunt he mentions in his memoirs, watched without flinching. Casanova himself had to look away repeatedly. The piercing shrieks of a man being slowly torn apart filled the square. 2 spectators died in the chaos, crushed in the crowd or fallen from balconies. The execution was claiming lives beyond its intended victim. And still, Damiens' body refused to come apart. The judge's original order had explicitly forbidden the executioners from cutting the tendons to facilitate the dismemberment. Perhaps they wanted the punishment to appear purely natural, the horses pulling apart what God had put together. Perhaps they simply hadn't anticipated this scenario. As darkness began to fall over Paris, the spectacle had gone on for hours longer than anyone had planned. The judges finally relented. They gave the order, use axes and saws. Legris and Sanson rushed forward. They began hacking at Damiens' joints, cutting through the tendons that had held his body together, despite everything the horses had done. Once the tendons were severed, the horses could finally do their work. The limbs separated, not cleanly, but violently. The right thigh came away first, then the left thigh, then the right arm, finally the left arm. According to observers, Damiens was still breathing when his right arm, the last limb, was torn from his body. Some accounts suggest he was still alive, looking at his own dismembered torso, until the moment the final limb separated. Then, at last, he died. What remained of Robert-François Damiens was thrown onto a pyre. The torso, the 4 severed limbs, whatever scraps of flesh the pincers had torn away, all of it was consumed by fire. When the flames had done their work, his ashes were scattered to the winds. No grave, no marker, no evidence that Robert-François Damiens had ever existed. The execution had lasted approximately 4 hours. It had required the failure of horses, the intervention of axes, the deaths of 2 spectators, and the revision of the judge's own orders. It was supposed to demonstrate the absolute power of the king. Instead, it had demonstrated something else entirely. Damiens' suffering did not end with his death. The sentence included provisions designed to erase his family from France entirely. His father, his wife, and his daughter were banished from the kingdom. His brothers and sisters were ordered to change their surnames, to abandon the name Damiens forever, and take new identities. All of his property, furniture, and belongings were confiscated by the crown. And the house where he had been born in La Tuileries? It was designated as forbidden ground. Nothing could be built on that spot. The very earth where Damiens had entered the world was cursed. The government wanted to ensure that no one would remember Robert-François Damiens. They wanted to erase him from history so completely that future would-be assassins would have no martyr to inspire them. They failed at this too. In the days following the execution, police were forced to remove seditious placards that appeared throughout Paris. The execution had not terrified the populace into submission. It had enraged them. The privileged classes, who had once attended public executions as entertainment, began to withdraw. What had once seemed like justice now seemed like barbarism. The botched dismemberment, the hours of failure, the drunken handlers, the weak horses, the eventual resort to axes, had made the crown look incompetent rather than powerful. The execution was supposed to send a message. The king's authority is absolute, and striking at the king means annihilation. The message the public received was different. The king's government can't even perform an execution properly. Within 32 years, a different king would face a different fate. Louis XVI, the grandson of the man Damiens had stabbed, would be executed in 1793. He would die by guillotine. The execution would take seconds. Charles-Henri Sanson was 18 years old when he supervised the execution of Robert-François Damiens. He was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he considered resigning from his position as chief executioner. He didn't resign. Instead, he became obsessed with finding a better way. The problem, as Sanson saw it, was that traditional methods of execution depended on too many variables. Horses could be weak, handlers could be drunk, human sinews could be stronger than anyone anticipated. A properly designed machine, on the other hand, would not fail. Years later, Sanson would help advocate for the adoption of a new device for capital punishment. A device with a heavy blade that fell from a height. A device that could not fail the way the horses had failed. The guillotine. When Louis XVI was executed on January 21, 1793, it was Charles-Henri Sanson who operated the machine. The same man who had watched Damiens' 4-hour ordeal as a traumatized teenager would deliver a death that took less than a minute. Was Robert-François Damiens truly acting alone? The magistrates never definitively answered this question. Some contemporaries suspected Jesuit manipulation, that enemies of the Jansenists had somehow encouraged this unstable man to strike at the king. Others thought Parlement magistrates had whispered sedition to him. Damiens himself was cryptic. He spoke of priests who had influenced him. He warned of future catastrophes. He claimed to be doing a good work for a heavenly reward. Under torture, real torture, not theatrical suffering, he never named a single accomplice. Either he had extraordinary resistance to pain, or he genuinely had no one to name. The most likely explanation is the simplest one. Robert-François Damiens was a mentally unstable man who had been surrounded by religious and political chaos. He absorbed the anger of those around him. He convinced himself that he had been chosen to save France. He stabbed a king with a penknife and penetrated exactly 1 centimetre. And for that 1 centimetre, he endured 4 hours of systematic destruction. The crime of parricide against the king was removed from French law in 1832, 75 years after Damiens' death. By then, France had executed a king, crowned an emperor, restored a king, overthrown that king, and restored another one. The world Damiens had lived in was gone. In 1975, the philosopher Michel Foucault opened his book Discipline and Punish with a detailed account of that day in the Place de Greve. He used it as the ultimate example of a system of power that had revealed its own bankruptcy. The execution was meant to show that the king's control over his subjects' bodies was total. What it actually showed was that some things cannot be controlled, not by kings, not by executioners, not by 4 horses pulling in 4 directions,